15 years is a long time to trust something. 15 years of updates, of reboots, of letting a single company make decisions about a machine you bought, a machine sitting in your home, running your work, holding your files. And for most of that time, I didn't question it. Windows was just the water I swam in. It was invisible the way infrastructure is invisible. You only notice it when something breaks. Then things started breaking, not in the dramatic blue screen of death way I was used to, something subtler, something that felt less like a bug and more like a policy. And one afternoon, after about the fourth time Windows Update interrupted something I was in the middle of, I opened a browser tab, pulled up a Linux download page, and started reading. What I found over the next few weeks changed the way I understood my own computer. And 6 months after flashing that installer onto a USB drive, I want to tell you exactly what happened. The good parts and the hard parts, the things nobody warned me about, and whether, if I could go back, I'd make the same call again. The answer to that last question is yes, but I want to earn that conclusion rather than just assert it. So let's start at the beginning. Before I get to Linux, you need to understand what finally pushed me over the edge, because it wasn't one thing, it was a pattern. And the pattern started becoming undeniable around the time Windows 11 rolled out its aggressive upgrade campaigns. I want to be precise here, because vague complaints about Microsoft are everywhere on the internet, and I'm not interested in adding to the noise. What I experienced was specific, and I think if you've been using Windows for any meaningful stretch of time, you'll recognize it. Let's start with telemetry. Windows has collected diagnostic and usage data from users for years. That's documented, that's public knowledge, it's in the privacy policy, but the scope of what's collected under the full telemetry setting, which was default on many installations, goes considerably further than most users would expect when they hear the phrase diagnostic data. According to research published by the privacy advocacy organization Privacy International and expanded on by independent security researcher Sami Kamkar, Windows sends data including typed input samples, application usage patterns, and browsing behavior back to Microsoft servers, even when users have adjusted privacy settings through the Windows UI. The Electronic Frontier Foundation raised flags about this as far back as Windows 10, noting in a detailed 2015 post that many of the opt-out controls visible in the settings menu don't actually stop data collection at the kernel level, they just remove the toggle from view. Think about that for a second. You've made a choice, and the system has acknowledged it, and the collection is still happening underneath. Now, Microsoft frames all of this as improving the product. And I'm not here to tell you that's entirely false. Some of it genuinely is product improvement data. But here's the thing that bothers me about that framing. There's no clean way for an average user to audit what's actually being sent. You cannot open a dashboard and see a log of outbound data. You cannot verify independently that the opt-outs are functioning as described. You're asked to accept the word of a company with a documented history of quietly expanding data practices with each major Windows release. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the public record. Then there's the recall feature. If you followed tech news in 2024, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Microsoft introduced Recall as part of the Copilot plus PC initiative, a feature that takes continuous screenshots of your screen activity, processes them with an on-device AI model, and makes your entire computing history searchable by natural language query. Microsoft's stated intention was to let you find anything you'd ever done on your computer by just describing it. Sound appealing? Here's what the security community found when they looked at the implementation. Kevin Beaumont, a well-respected cybersecurity researcher with a long history of auditing Microsoft products, published a detailed technical breakdown showing that the Recall database, storing all those screenshots, was left unencrypted and accessible to other applications running on the system. That means any malware already present on the machine, or any attacker who gained local access through any vector, could, in theory, extract a complete visual record of everything you'd ever done on that computer. Your banking sessions, your private messages, your passwords typed into login fields, every document you'd opened, all of it in a single queryable database sitting unprotected on your drive. Microsoft paused the Recall rollout after the backlash, eventually adding encryption and moving it to opt-in. But the feature itself, and more importantly, the philosophy it represents, told me something I couldn't unhear about where Windows is heading. The architecture of Recall assumes that continuously recording your screen activity is a reasonable default. It assumes that your local machine should maintain a surveillance log of your own behavior in service of a search feature. The security failure was real, but it was almost secondary to the underlying premise. Stay with me here, because this is the part that really crystallized things for me. Microsoft is building Windows around a data model where your activity on your own machine is an asset, something to be processed, stored, and eventually used for AI training, product improvement, or advertising partnerships. It's like owning a car and finding out the manufacturer has been logging every trip you've taken, every conversation you've had in it, every destination you visited, and when you ask them to, stop, they tell you it's for your safety. Your passwords, your documents, your financial statements, your personal correspondence, all of it is potentially part of that picture. When I understood the shape of that model clearly, I stopped treating Linux as an interesting experiment and started treating it as a practical response to a real problem. And then there's the hardware angle, which honestly is what put a deadline on my decision. I built my current machine in 2019. It's fast, it handles everything I do, video editing, software development, the full workload, and it will continue to be capable hardware for years. We're a pseudo requirement. Microsoft's official position is that Windows 10 support ends in October 2025, after which security patches stop arriving for machines that don't meet the hardware cutoff. According to Canalys, a technology market research firm, roughly 240 million PCs currently running Windows 10 are expected to be ineligible for Windows 11. That number is not a rounding error. That is a deliberate decision to force 250 million functional machines toward either a paid extended support program, a new hardware purchase, or unsupported operation. And for a lot of people, it's a push toward just buying a new Windows machine, which happens to include all the new data collection features baked in by default. When I understood the scale of that and combined it with everything I'd already been noticing about Windows, I stopped asking whether I should switch and started asking which distribution I should start with. The day I installed Linux, I felt something I didn't expect. I felt like a beginner again. And I want to be honest with you about what that actually means, because the Linux community has a tendency to present the experience in one of two ways that I think are both misleading. Some people tell you it's effortless, that it just works, that you'll wonder why you waited. Other people treat the difficulty as a virtue, as if suffering through a steep learning curve is a necessary rite of passage that proves your seriousness as a computer user. Neither of those framings is useful. The truth is more human than either of them. 804 LTS as my starting point. Not because it's universally considered the best Linux distribution. That's a debate with no clean answer and strong opinions on every side. But because for someone arriving from a long Windows background, it offers the widest hardware compatibility, the largest user community, and the most comprehensive public documentation. If you're going to be troubleshooting on the fly, which you will be in the early weeks regardless of which distribution you choose, you want the largest possible ecosystem of people who have already hit your exact problem and written about it somewhere searchable. I also spent about 2 weeks running Fedora on a secondary drive alongside Ubuntu. Fedora is genuinely faster and uses more current software versions, but its shorter release cycle means you're doing more maintenance work to stay current, and I found that balance tipped against it for a daily driver. Long-term support was the right call for my situation. The installation took about 20 minutes and went cleanly. Ubuntu detected my GPU without intervention, found my network card, set my monitors to the correct resolution automatically. 5 years ago, that level of hardware detection on first boot wasn't something you could count on. The Linux driver situation has genuinely improved, largely because more manufacturers are contributing drivers upstream, and because the kernel development community has expanded coverage significantly. So that part was better than I expected. What hit me in the first week wasn't hardware, it was software muscle memory. I'd used certain Windows applications for years, Adobe Premiere, specific development utilities, a handful of tools that were Windows only and for which the ecosystem had never produced a true equivalent. The Linux community's answer to this is often the alternatives are just as good, and I want to engage with that honestly, rather than just agreeing or dismissing it. Some alternatives genuinely are as good. LibreOffice handles the vast majority of document and spreadsheet work without friction. For development work, Linux's native toolchain is actually stronger than Windows in many respects. The terminal, the package management system, the integration with version control tools. But there are specific professional applications where the alternatives fall short of a direct replacement, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone making a real decision. If Adobe's Creative Suite is central to your professional workflow, that's a genuine complication that requires a genuine answer, not reassurance. There's also the terminal, which deserves its own honest treatment. Linux is more terminal forward than Windows, and if command line interaction makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is going to surface, not constantly. Ubuntu's graphical interface handles the vast majority of everyday tasks without ever needing a terminal window. But when something breaks, when you need software that isn't in the graphical package manager, when you're debugging a hardware issue, you will be reading and typing commands. I want to say something about that fear though, because I had it too. The terminal is learnable. The commands follow logical patterns. The documentation is thorough and written by people who genuinely want you to succeed. The Ubuntu community, on forums like Ask Ubuntu and the broader Linux Stack Exchange, is patient with beginners in a way I didn't anticipate. My relationship with the terminal went from anxiety in week 1 to comfortable competence by week 6 to, by month 3, a genuine preference for terminal operations over their GUI equivalents for certain tasks. That ARC is available to anyone willing to spend a few weeks on it. Here's what the Linux evangelists don't tell you, and what the Windows defenders don't want you to hear either. The real story of switching isn't dramatic in either direction. It's a series of small adjustments that compound over time into something that feels, eventually, completely ordinary. Let me walk you through what actually changed across those 6 months. What got better, what stayed difficult, and what surprised me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Before I get into what the day-to-day experience actually looks like, let me address the question I know is sitting in the back of your mind. Was it worth the disruption? And I want to answer that honestly rather than immediately, because the honest answer requires context. The short version is yes. The longer version is, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish and what you're willing to invest in the transition. I'm going to give you both versions over the next few minutes, and I'm going to be specific enough that you can actually map my experience onto your own situation and make a real assessment. That's more useful than a motivational speech in either direction. The first 30 days were the adjustment period, and I won't soften that. The biggest practical friction point for me was gaming. I play games, not obsessively but regularly, as a genuine part of how I spend leisure time. The state of Linux gaming has improved dramatically over the past few years, largely because of Valve's Proton Compatibility layer, which allows a significant portion of the Windows Steam library to run on Linux without modification. According to ProtonDB, a community-maintained database that tracks compatibility across the Steam catalog, roughly 80% of the top 1,000 games on the platform run with at least a gold rating on Linux, meaning they work correctly with minor or no tweaking. And that's a real number and a real improvement, but the remaining 20% is meaningful. Some of the games in my regular rotation don't work on Linux, primarily because of anti-cheat software. Easy Anti-Cheat and BattlEye have added native Linux support for some titles. But adoption is uneven, and multiplayer games with competitive integrity concerns have been slow to enable it. If gaming represents a significant portion of your Windows use, and if the specific games you play are in that incompatible category, this is a real limitation, and I'd rather you know it going in than discover it after you've already wiped your drive. I also hit a printer issue in week 2 that took me an evening to resolve. This is exactly the kind of thing that doesn't make it into Linux promotion material, but absolutely makes it into the Linux experience. My laser printer, a standard mid-range unit from a major manufacturer, wasn't fully supported by the open source drivers available in Ubuntu's default software repositories. The printer was detected, but duplex printing didn't function, and the paper size settings weren't applying correctly. Resolving it required locating a proprietary driver package on the manufacturer's website, downloading it, and installing it manually through a terminal command. The whole process took about 2 hours, including research time. On Windows, the driver would have installed automatically in the background. I'm including this not because it made me regret switching, but because managing your own expectations is genuinely useful. If you arrive expecting everything to work immediately, an evening like that feels like a failure. If you arrive knowing that occasional troubleshooting is part of the experience, it's just a Tuesday. By day 60, I had reached something like equilibrium. I want to be specific about what that means, because equilibrium can sound like resignation. Like you've just stopped noticing the problems. That wasn't it. The application substitutions I'd made felt normal to use. I'd stopped thinking about them as substitutes and started thinking about them as just my tools. My development workflow had actually improved meaningfully. Linux's native environment for programming is genuinely well suited to the work. The package, management system, the terminal tooling, the file system structure all feel like they were designed with development in mind, because in a real historical sense they were. And something I hadn't anticipated. The machine felt quieter. Not in terms of fan noise, though actually that improved too. Quieter in terms of system intrusion. No update notifications at inopportune moments. No Cortana suggestions appearing in search results. No background CPU spikes from processes I hadn't asked to run. The experience of just sitting down and doing work without the operating system requiring my attention was something I'd apparently been missing for years without having a reference point for what it felt like. Performance was one of the biggest concrete surprises. On identical hardware, same CPU, same RAM configuration, same SSD, Ubuntu felt meaningfully faster than Windows 11 had in everyday use. Boot times dropped by roughly 40%. Application launch was snappier. Background RAM usage at idle was approximately half of what Windows maintained with its default services running. I ran formal benchmarks using Fornix Test Suite, an open source performance testing platform, and across CPU-intensive workloads and storage throughput tests. Linux outperformed Windows on my hardware by margins ranging from 8 to 23% depending on the specific test. Some of that is attributable to the difference in background services. Linux isn't running telemetry processes, cloud sync services, and the Windows subsystem overhead that Windows maintains by default. But some of it is architectural. Linux is a leaner operating system at its core. built on a different set of design priorities than Windows, which has accumulated decades of backward compatibility requirements and feature additions. On hardware you already own, the performance difference is effectively a free upgrade. The security architecture was also different in ways that took me a while to fully appreciate. Linux's permission model, the way it handles process privileges and system access, is structurally more restrictive than Windows by default. Applications run with the minimum access necessary for their function. Administrative privileges require explicit elevation every time, and the system is transparent about when that's happening and why. The attack surface for malicious software is smaller, both because Linux represents a smaller market target for criminal operators, and because the permission architecture creates structural barriers to the kind of system-wide damage that Windows malware can achieve. When a piece of Windows ransomware encrypts an entire drive, including system files, it can do that because the permission model allows applications to reach those files. On a standard Linux setup, that kind of access requires elevation that a quietly installed piece of malware typically doesn't have. Professor Ross Anderson of the University of Cambridge, whose research on security engineering is widely cited in the field, has written about how the multi-user permission design inherited by Linux from Unix creates structural resistance to the propagation patterns that make Windows malware so effective. This doesn't mean Linux is immune. There are Linux vulnerabilities, there are documented Linux exploits, and a misconfigured or poorly maintained Linux system can absolutely be compromised. But the default security posture is genuinely more conservative. Running Linux doesn't replace good security hygiene, keeping software updated, using strong authentication, being careful about what you install. But it does mean the baseline is meaningfully stronger than what Windows offers out of the box. Month 3 through 6 was when the transition stopped feeling like a transition. I stopped framing tasks as how do I do this on Linux and started just doing them. New muscle memory had formed. I'd moved from GNOME, Ubuntu's default desktop environment, to KDE Plasma after about 2 months, because I wanted more granular control over window behavior and keyboard shortcuts. And KDE offers a level of customization that genuinely doesn't have an equivalent in Windows. I could control the exact animation speed of window transitions, set per application keyboard shortcuts, configure precisely how virtual desktops behaved, and adjust the file manager down to which columns were visible in list view. These might sound like small details, and individually, each one is. But the cumulative effect of a computing environment shaped exactly to your habits, rather than to a mass market default, is something that's hard to describe until you've experienced it. And once you have it, giving it up feels like a real cost. I want to address something directly before this starts to sound like pure advocacy, because I think intellectual honesty requires it. Linux is not the right move for everyone, and saying otherwise would make me exactly the kind of overselling evangelist I criticized at the start of this. The right question isn't, is Linux better than Windows in some abstract universal sense? The right question is whether it's better for your specific workload, your specific hardware, and your specific tolerance for occasional troubleshooting. Those answers vary by person, and they vary meaningfully. If your professional work requires specific Windows-only software with no functional Linux equivalent, certain engineering applications, specialized enterprise tools, Adobe's full creative ecosystem, then the productivity cost of switching is real, and you need to weigh it honestly against what you'd gain. If gaming is your primary use for a computer, and the games you care about are in the incompatible category, the frustration is real, and anti-cheat compatibility isn't improving fast enough to pretend otherwise. If you don't want to spend occasional evenings troubleshooting driver issues or learning terminal commands, that preference is entirely legitimate. Windows, even with all of the friction points I've described, is a high compatibility environment that works with an enormous range of hardware and software out of the box. For certain users and certain workflows, that compatibility value is real. I'm not here to argue you out of it. So after 6 months, here's where I actually stand. I'm not going back to Windows. That's the honest conclusion, and I want to explain what it's based on without making it sound more ideological than it is, because my reasons are mostly practical. So after 6 months, here's where I actually stand. I'm not going back to Windows. That's the honest conclusion. And I want to explain what it's based on without making it sound more ideological than it is, because my reasons are mostly practical. I didn't switch because I hate Microsoft or because I have a philosophical position about open source software that overrides everything else. I switched because the concrete experience of using my machine got better when I did, and because I could see clearly where Windows was heading and decided I didn't want to go there. There's something that I think gets lost in these platform debates, which tend to become identity arguments pretty quickly. People talk about Windows versus Linux like it's a team sport. Like choosing one means you're a particular kind of person and need to defend that identity. I spent 15 years on Windows. I don't regret those years. The platform served me well for most of them. What changed wasn't some revelation about Windows being secretly evil the whole time. What changed is that Windows, as a product and as a business, has been moving in a specific direction for the past several years, and that direction leads somewhere I don't want to go. You might look at that same direction and decide the trade-offs are acceptable for your situation. That's a legitimate call. I'm just telling you what I found when I looked at it clearly. The thing that kept me on Windows for 15 years wasn't loyalty. It wasn't preference. It was inertia. The accumulated weight of familiarity, of installed software, of workflows that function because I'd built them around a particular environment over a long period of time. What I discovered when I finally forced a change is that inertia is not the same as preference. When you actually live with an alternative for long enough for new habits to form, you find out what you genuinely value and what was just habit. What I found is that I wasn't attached to Windows. I was attached to productivity and reliability and control over my own machine. Linux gives me those things. Windows, in its current and clearly intended future form, was starting to erode the last one. There's a bigger picture here that's worth naming plainly. Microsoft is making a series of deliberate decisions about Windows that reflect a particular vision of what a personal computer is for. The recall architecture, the telemetry scope, the hardware cutoffs that render functional machines obsolete, the AI features that are increasingly difficult to fully disable, the integration of cloud, services into the core operating system experience. These are not accidents. They are a direction. The direction is toward a model where your personal computer is a service endpoint rather than a tool you own outright, where Microsoft's interests and your interests overlap significantly, but not entirely, and where the places they diverge are becoming structurally harder to work around with each major release. You don't have to accept that as the default. That's what I keep coming back to, and I think it's the most important thing I can leave you with. There are real alternatives. Not perfect, not friction-free, but real and available, and for many people, genuinely better suited to what they actually need from a computer. Ubuntu's installer is friendlier than it's been at any point in Linux's history. The documentation is comprehensive and maintained by a large community. Hardware support in 2024 and 2025 is better than it has ever been. The gaming situation, while imperfect, is improving year over year. If you've been sitting on the fence, the barrier to at least trying Linux, booting a live USB without touching your existing installation, is genuinely low. You can sit in that environment for an afternoon, open a browser, try the terminal, get a feel for what it's actually like, and make an informed decision rather than a theoretical one. If you've been feeling like something was off, like the machine on your desk was slowly becoming less yours and more a managed endpoint for someone else's platform, you weren't imagining it. The telemetry data, the recall architecture, the hardware obsolescence timeline, the AI features that are opt-out rather than opt-in. These are real, documented, and intentional. And you have options you may not have seriously looked at in a while. I switched after 15 years. The first few weeks required real adjustment. 6 months later, the adjustment is done, the workflow is solid, the performance is better, and I'm not looking back. What actually happened is that I found out the wall I'd been living next to for 15 years had a door in it. And once I walked through, the other side was considerably more spacious than I'd been told to expect. If this breakdown gave you something real to think about, subscribe. I cover these platform decisions, privacy developments, and the honest practical realities of changing your tech setup as they happen, not months later when the conversation has moved on. And drop a comment. Are you still on Windows? Have you already switched, or are you somewhere in the middle of making the decision? I read everyone. This conversation is worth having.